Who's the teacher?
I can do it this time.
Go ahead.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. This is Rachel. She's going to do her speech for you guys today, and you need to, pay close attention. I'm sure her speech will be great. Take good notes and think about what diversity she's going to be dispelling for us today.
Okay, I'm going to be talking about the book Teaching in a Flat World, and it's about learning from high-performing systems around the world. So the first thing that you notice when you notice the title of the book is it calls our world flat. And it's not talking about like ancient history. It's talking more about globalization. A few years ago I read a book called The World is Flat, and it was about globalization and how technology has influenced our world. It talks about how we can now communicate across the globe, and that has never been possible before. And so in looking at that in the context of this book, Dr. Darling Hammond uses this ability to talk to other countries around the globe to look at their education systems to help improve our own. Here's a little about Dr. Darling Hammond, and then after that we're going to talk about kind of what she talked about in the book and how she thinks that our education system can improve, and then after that we're going to talk about how to apply that in our classrooms. Dr. Darling Hammond was born in Cleveland. She was the first woman in her family to go to college, and she was one of the first women to go to Yale, just overall. She received her bachelor's from Yale. She taught in the public school system, and then she eventually went on to teach in the Pennsylvania public school system. When she taught there, she felt like she had been kind of thrown into the fire, like she didn't feel prepared at all to be an educator. And so due to this, she went back and got her doctorate in education from Temple University to help teach teachers how to be teachers. That way that when students go into the classroom, they feel prepared for what they're going into. Recently, one of the most impressive things on her resume is that she worked with the Obama administration in transitioning the Department of Education from the Bush administration to the Obama administration. So now we're going to look at what she kind of talked about in all these different countries. First she looks at the U.S. and kind of takes a very critical approach at our education system. And then she looks at Finland, Ontario, and Singapore, who are some of the top education systems in the world, and tries to see what they're doing right and how we can apply that to our own nation. And those are just some of the things that she looked at: demographics, recruitment, professional development, teaching methods, cultural climate, and those are things that she looked at in those school systems to try and see what they were doing differently. So one of the biggest demographics that she talks about in the book is how the pay scale we think is very different. We think that other countries make so much more money as teachers, but they really don't make that much more money. Some of them even make significantly less than we do on average. And it was kind of shocking to me, because I always thought, we make nothing here. These other countries where it's such a desirable profession, they have to make more. But one of the things that she did recognize was that in these other countries like Finland and Ontario, that's what professionals are making. That's what doctors and lawyers are making. Their economy is just a little bit different than ours. However, it's still pretty telling that they don't make very much money. Some other demographics that she talked about, or that in other countries, it is a still very female-dominated profession. There's not as many males, and that demographic isn't changing, and it hasn't changed over the past few years. It's still predominantly female. But one of the things that she did note in other countries is their teaching population is very strictly female, and it is also very racially the same makeup. They don't have a lot of minorities in the teaching profession in other countries, even though their countries are very culturally diverse. And that's something where we're very different. We have become more diversified over the past 10 years. We have a lot more minorities in the teaching profession than we had in the past. We also have a lot more new teachers than these other countries. And so that is something that is very different, and it's an issue that we have to address in our own nation, and it's something that we can't compare to. And then we're going to move on to recruitment and how they recruit their teachers and how their teacher education systems look in other countries. In the U.S., there really isn't any standard to education or recruitment for education. Colleges just kind of do what they want. But that is not the case in these other countries. In Finland, every teacher, your education is paid for. I wish I could move to Finland right now. Their education is completely paid for. They don't have to worry about paying back loans or anything. And their education is controlled pretty well. They have like a Ministry of Education there that oversees the process. So it's not exactly the same at every university, but it is very standardized. There's a very competitive market. It said somewhere around 5,000 applicants are accepted every year into the teacher ed program out of 20,000 applicants. And so I know that here in the U.S. it's kind of like you apply, you get in. Everybody who wants to be a teacher goes into the teacher education field, and you may not get a job necessarily, but you're accepted into the program. There it's a little bit more strenuous of a process to go through. In Ontario, they have the College of Teachers similar to the Ministry of Education, and they kind of oversee the process of teacher education. And like Finland, it is a highly competitive market. But in a little bit of a different way, they have a very oversaturated market, so there's too many teachers and not enough jobs. So the unemployment rate is very high, but it's still a very highly sought after job, which was surprising to me. People are still going into teacher education, and those numbers haven't dwindled at all, even though the unemployment rate is so high. So that kind of shows how much people want to be teachers in Ontario. In Singapore, they also have a Ministry of Education that looks over the recruitment process, and theirs is very strict as well. In Singapore specifically, they actually look at the high schools, and they take like the top quarter of students in high schools, and they say, hey, you guys want to become teachers? They take the smart kids, and they pull them out, and they say, we want you to be teachers. And something different about their teacher education that was interesting to me is your first 2 years are kind of similar to your student teaching program here. You get assigned to a school. It can be anywhere in the country. It's usually at a school that needs a lot of help, similar to a school like a Title I school here in the U.S. And then they're assigned mentor teachers. And so it's a very highly intensive training program. They don't have as many hours to teach during the school day when they're first starting out. That way they can really work on their teaching ability, and they can invest more time in themselves versus just being thrown into the classroom like a lot of other countries do. So their teacher education system is probably the strongest of these 4 countries. Now, this is kind of the interesting part to me that she didn't talk a lot about in the book, but it was diversity. And I kind of focus on this because that is the purpose of this presentation, is to find the diversity in our novels. And so this, I was looking at it, and I was trying to figure out what the differences between these countries were. Because when I was looking at the stats, they weren't all that different. They were very similar. But here in the U.S., our education system is struggling, and everywhere else is not struggling as much. And so I was trying to figure out, why are we so different? And so I began looking at the census website, and I started looking at population. The U.S. population is around 324,500,000 people. This isn't based on size. These pictures are not. It's based on population. Finland only has about 5.5 million people, which is the size of Minnesota. And similarly, Ontario is about the same size as Illinois, and Singapore is about the same size as Wisconsin. So these countries are like the size of one of our states. So it's much easier to regulate their education systems when you don't have to regulate 324 million people across 50 states that all have very individualized education systems. And so you end up kind of stepping on people's toes, stepping on the state's toes, and it gets into this whole conservative liberal argument about how we handle education. In these countries, they don't have that problem because it's such a small system. They don't have thousands of colleges across the country to regulate. They only have a few. So it's much easier to regulate there. That may be why our country is a little less regulated as far as teacher education goes. Next, I look at language, and we only have one official language here in the U.S., which, if you've been in any school anywhere, you know that more than one language is spoken in schools. A lot of students are Spanish speaking or have other native languages that they speak at home. And so that can make education a little more difficult, especially since our country doesn't recognize those languages officially, and so we don't have teachers who know how to speak all those languages. The most teachers that we have who speak a second language is Spanish, but we have other languages in our nation that are spoken. In Ontario, they have French and English spoken, and they're both official languages. So it is a big process in the education system to have as many French teachers as you do English teachers, especially if they're bilingual. That is very important in Ontario. Most students who go into education are bilingual because you need that advantage in their job market. Here we don't have that. Most teachers are not bilingual, and so that is something that sets them apart. And it's the same exact way in Finland. They speak Finnish and Swedish, and most teachers speak both languages. Singapore is on the different end of the spectrum. They have 4 national languages: English, Malay, Tamil, and Mandarin. But there are tons of languages spoken in Singapore, and they're all just slightly different. It's almost like our dialects or Chinese languages in China, because it's just, they're all just a little bit different, but different enough that they're separate languages. And so the teachers have to address that, and they're doing a really good job of hiring a good, diverse teacher population to handle that problem. If we look at the rates of poverty, it's a little telling about the populations of these countries. I thought a lot about the Ruby Payne novel and how she talked about how much poverty affects schooling. I'm not saying that it doesn't, because it does. But, however, these countries have close to our rates of poverty or even higher. Ontario has a very high rate of poverty, especially in young families with children. So I was wondering why the poverty isn't affecting their assessments and why the poverty isn't affecting their education system. And it's because these other countries, they kind of work with the poverty. They see what their schools need individually, and they compensate for it. So they're giving these students 3 meals a day, and they're making sure that they have the school supplies that they need, and they may give the students uniforms instead of making them buy their own clothes. They help out these kids as much as they can, and that's something that I think our nation needs to look at doing. It's expensive, but it's working in other countries to help compensate for that poverty issue. So I kind of looked back over this book and the statistics that I looked up and tried to figure out how I can use this to make myself a better teacher. And I realized that we are a very diverse nation in comparison to these other nations. And I think diversity is our strength in the U.S. We can either use it as like this excuse as to why our education system is failing, or we can use it to our advantages. In our classrooms, we're going to have tons of diversity. Like Catherine talked about, you're going to have students with different ability levels, especially in a math classroom, and that's something that you have to address. In English, you're going to have students who have different spoken languages, even if it's just a different racial dialect. You're going to have those problems, but if you address them from the beginning and you use them to your advantage, it'll help you. So I looked at cooperative learning groups and more of a constructivist style classroom where students work together, which is very common in Singapore where they have this language barrier, and it has helped their system so much. So in my classroom, I could use group work and group learning so that they experience different people's languages, they experience different dialects, they experience different races. And instead of using diversity as a barrier between students to separate them, it'll bring them together and allow them to work together. They'll get to see this diversity in a very controlled environment where they can learn from it, versus just seeing it from an outsider's perspective and using it to judge other people. So lastly, I wanted to end on a quote as defined by Malcolm Forbes, which I thought really encompassed my view of diversity, especially in a math classroom. And it's, diversity is the art of thinking independently together. And it goes straight back to that cooperative learning between students and making sure that students work together despite their differences.
Question.